DOE CSGF Fellow Claire Hebert in the field of cosmology at Stanford University.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in today. I'm a fourth-year PhD student in applied physics at Stanford University. I'll spend most of my time today telling you about my thesis work on precision cosmology with Vera C. Rubin Observatory. Cosmology is the study of the history and the future of the universe. And one of the many questions cosmologists ask is, how did structure, such as stars and galaxies, form? The early universe had an almost uniform density of matter, whereas matter today has structure, as we can see in this plot, where each dot represents a galaxy, and you can see a complex web-like structure. So the first part of the answer to how did structure grow is gravity. There were regions of slight matter overdensity that attracted more and more matter as the universe went on, and those eventually turned into stars, galaxies, and eventually this cosmic web of galaxies. There's also something we call dark energy, but which we don't really understand. And this causes space to expand at an ever-increasing rate. And this expansion of space reduces structure on large scales. As cosmologists, we'd like to understand dark energy better, so we try to make measurements of its properties. How do we do that? Since growth of structure is sensitive to dark energy, as we just saw, we can use it as a probe for dark energy. One way we quantify structure is by measuring correlations in the distribution of matter. So for instance, we can calculate a correlation function of the positions of galaxies. So each data point on this plot says something about how correlated the positions of galaxies are at each of these angular scales. And we denote this GG for galaxy-galaxy correlation. There are other correlations that we can measure. So for instance, light from background galaxies out, say, at 1 billion light years away, the light from those galaxies travels to us in straight lines, but through curved space. And the space is curved by the presence of these other galaxies in this matter distribution. And this curved space causes their shapes to be distorted once we measure them here on Earth. And the distortions depend on the large-scale matter structure. And so this correlation is also a probe of dark energy. So I'll denote this SS because we're correlating the distortions in shapes, again, as a function of angular scale on the sky. The universe is not static, and so we want to measure these correlations as a function of distance or redshift as well. So what we're really measuring is a whole bunch of correlation functions for both galaxy positions and distortions of galaxy shapes as a function of angle on the sky and as a function of distance. What I really want to emphasize here is that these measurements require a lot of data. And Vera C. Rubin Observatory is built in part to perform exactly this task. It's an observatory currently under construction in the Chilean Andes, and it's expected to turn on late next year in 2021. It's unique because of its large light collecting area, and this is a product of a combination of a really large field of view, which means you can image a large portion of the sky at one time, and a very large mirror, which means it's collecting a lot of photons so it can take images very quickly. The first 10 years of its operation will be dedicated to the Legacy Survey of Space and Time, or LSST. We call this a survey because we're not pointing at a specific object and trying to measure something about it. Rather, we're mapping out the entire visible sky. Over the course of 10 years, it will image billions of galaxies and produce 60 petabytes of images. So that's great. We're going to have some great science coming out of all of this data. But there are still challenges. One thing I want to highlight is the difference between statistical precision and accuracy. If we take another look at this distortion of shape correlation plot, I'll just highlight one of these data points. For now, let's just assume that the black line, the fit line, is the ground truth. So we can see that this data point is inaccurate and imprecise. It's imprecise because it has large error bars, and it's inaccurate because it's more than 1 sigma away from the truth. If we have high statistical precision, our error bars shrink, but we're still inaccurate. And what we really want is an accurate and precise measurement. In the context of these cosmological correlations that we've been talking about, the sources of noise that could bias our results is noise that affects all of these data points at the same time. And so this would be a noise that is spatially correlated. And there are many such effects that could bias our results. And so we really need to study each one independently and gauge whether it's significant in terms of its magnitude relative to our signals. And if it is significant, how do we mitigate it? So I have focused on 2 such effects, atmospheric turbulence and instrument noise, and I'll touch on both of those today. The atmosphere distorts light as it travels from space to the Earth. So for example, if you're looking at a star in the night sky, you'll see it sort of twinkling. And that's not because the brightness of the star itself is changing, but rather as the light passes through the atmosphere, it's getting distorted and shifted in a way that makes it look like it's changing. So I'll show a brief little movie. On the left, we're just going to see a little movie of a star's image as it's coming onto the telescope. And on the right, we're just integrating this, so taking a 15-second exposure like we do commonly in astronomy. And you'll see that the centroid on the left is actually moving around quite a lot through the course of this exposure. And as we average or integrate all of those short exposures, the image on the right becomes sort of smooth and round with time, but it's not completely round, and we sort of care about the shape that's left over at the end. This effect is spatially correlated because the atmosphere itself is spatially correlated. And if we look at the relative magnitudes of these effects, on the left is that same cosmological correlation that we've seen a few times, and on the right is an atmospheric correlation, so the correlation of shapes sort of imprinted by this atmospheric effect. And I just want to highlight that the magnitudes of these are very comparable, and so this is something that really matters for cosmology. And there are algorithms that we use to model and mitigate these effects, and they're optimized using simulations of the atmosphere. And if we want our algorithms to perform robustly on real data once we have it, we really need to make sure that the simulations we use to develop the algorithms are realistic. So 2 of the projects that I've worked on here is establishing realistic input parameters for the simulations, and then validating these simulations on high quality real data. The simulations rely heavily on inputs such as wind speeds, which dictate how the turbulence flows across the telescope. Instead of randomly selecting these wind speeds and directions, as is currently done, I've developed a method of using outputs from the NOAA Global Forecasting System. Some examples of these predictions are shown in the right plot. Each color depicts 1 snapshot in time across 20 different altitudes. There's 2 main things to note about this plot. Firstly, there are definite correlations in wind speeds as you go up in the atmosphere. So taking random draws is not realistic. And secondly, near the ground, something kind of strange happens and everything collapses down. And that's because the global forecasting system has boundary conditions where below ground wind speeds should be 0, which makes sense. But if we think about it in terms of this science problem with the telescope at the ground, we know that there are non-zero wind speeds there. And so what I've done is to combine measurements of wind speed from the telescope site to augment this data. And then if we combine them, we can provide more realistic wind behavior in our simulations. Once we have simulations, we want to validate them and make sure that the outputs look something like the real data. So this is the same movie that I showed a few slides earlier. This was taken at a telescope right next door to Rubin Observatory. These are very, very finely sampled in time. And so this allows us to do a study of how this atmospheric distortion in the shape changes as a function of exposure time. So here I'm showing ellipticity, which is how we quantify the shape distortion, as a function of exposure time for both data and simulation. While the magnitudes are slightly different, we see that they're falling off pretty similarly for both. Another thing we can look at is how correlated in time two successive exposures might be. So here we use a parameterization for ellipticity that breaks this down into E1 and E2, two orthogonal parameters. And I've plotted how the parameter at one time versus the parameter 30 seconds later. What we can see by calculating Pearson correlation coefficients is that the data is much more strongly correlated than the simulations. This is a discrepancy that might be due to an issue in the simulations that I'm currently investigating. So this is just some ideas or some ways in which we're using simulations and validating them on real data. And so after the light travels through the atmosphere, it hits our telescope, or some of it will enter our telescope. And here it hits the sensors and produces electrons. These electrons are then read out through some electronics and turned into a digital signal, and this is what we can look at on a screen. The LSST camera is what we call the camera that's going to be in the Rubin Observatory. It's currently at SLAC, being thoroughly tested. And it's the biggest digital camera in the world with 3.2 gigapixels. So even though there are these very strict requirements on the quality of the sensors, there's always some issues that we don't expect. And one of these has been correlations in read noise. And read noise is something that occurs when the readout electronics, which convert electrons to digital signal, have some fluctuations of noise, which is expected. This happens in all detectors. But here we are seeing this correlation between subsensors in the LSST camera. This is probably due to the fact that all of our electronics and cabling are housed in a very tight space. And to give you a sense of the magnitude of this effect, a variance of 200 counts corresponds to about a sixth the flux of a faint galaxy. So if we imagine taking some of the sensors down here in the right-hand bottom corner, which do see significant correlations in read noise, and we try to image two objects with this. If you have a fluctuation in read noise in one of them, a high correlation means you're likely to have the same fluctuation in the other, or a similar fluctuation. So you could imagine that both of these galaxies would be brighter, or both of them would be dimmer because of the noise. So when we prepare our samples for a science analysis, we typically do a brightness cut, which means we don't include faint galaxies in our samples because they're hard to measure accurately. So this read noise fluctuation could be important for us because if you imagine that these two galaxies were just below the brightness threshold and they both had a noise fluctuation that was correlated and brought the pair of galaxies into our sample, we'd be seeing an excess. Of course, the reverse could also happen where two galaxies would be kicked out of the sample, but because the distribution of galaxies as a function of brightness is not uniform, we're actually going to increase our sample with these pairs of galaxies more than we are decreasing it. And the last important thing to note here is that there's an angular scale associated with these sensors. And so not only are we getting more galaxies into our sample, but they're going to be associated with a particular angular scale, which means we would be counting an excess number of galaxies in particular angular bins, which would bias our cosmological correlation functions. So this project is still getting off the ground, but I just wanted to highlight it as a specific example of an instrument effect that we're trying to quantify and understand. So looking forwards, the Rubin Observatory will provide us with a lot of the data that we need to make the most precise measurements yet of dark energy. But our success with this depends on all of these detailed studies characterizing potential systematic biases, and for those we use numerical simulations, computational techniques, and comparisons with data. And it's a really exciting time to be part of this effort because the survey data is coming soon. And before I stop for questions, I wanted to briefly mention my practicum experience because they've been such a big part of what CSGF has given me. I spent 2 summers at Los Alamos in beautiful northern New Mexico with the stats group there, learning about and using powerful statistical methods to build models to estimate the composition of the Mars surface. This was a really exciting project, and I got to work with some really great people. And I wanted to finish off by thanking some wonderful people, my research group and my science collaboration, my practicum hosts, Carrie Myers and Earl Lawrence. The 3 of us are pictured here on the LANL group website, which was exciting to see. The CSGF fellows have become friends and colleagues. And then lastly, and most importantly, CSGF and the staff at Krell for making all of this possible. Thanks.